The topic of digital ID in the UK tends to elicit strong opinions. Some private identity providers worry the proposed gov.uk government wallet will have an unfair advantage over those offered by companies certified under the government's own Digital Verification Services Trust framework. Meanwhile, NGOs oppose a centralized government ID on the grounds that it could lead to mass surveillance and authoritarian control. I'm Joel McConvey. Today, a special edition of the Biometric Update podcast hosts a discussion with David Crack, Chair of the Association of Digital Verification Professionals, or ADVP, and Phil Booth, National Co-ordinator of the NO2ID campaign. Well, we're here to talk today about the ever-popular issue of digital ID in the UK, or not popular, as the case may be. We have two different viewpoints here today. I'd like to begin by asking Phil Booth from NO2ID to explain why he's here. What is NO2ID, and where do you sort of sit on this fence, Phil?
Sure. Thanks, Joel. I'm as you say, I'm National Coordinator of NO2ID, and this is a role that I previously had in 2004 to 2011 when we stopped the previous Blair government from introducing ID cards and a national identity register. Obviously, technologies were different back then, but broadly speaking, it was a digital system, and all sorts of things came up. NO2ID's position is very clear. This current scheme, as it has been architected and as it is being built and imposed on people, must be stopped. That is not to say, however, that, and despite the NO2ID brand, that we don't understand that we live in a world in which we need to prove all sorts of things about ourselves to various levels of assurance, when and where appropriate, and to do it in hopefully a minimally disclosive way. But the crucial thing being that we, the citizen, the individual, are in control of our data. And the whole premise of these centralised systems that we see, not just in the UK but all around the world, are this sort of one ring to rule them all type thinking, which has and does play out badly. Maybe not for everyone, but for many people and many groups and for many reasons. So that's why NO2ID, if you like, the brand, has its strapline, which is stop the database state. And the database state we defined back in 2004 as being that attempt to control people by watching them using computers. Technology moves on. This is another example of a particular way of going about architecting an ID scheme, but as I'm sure we'll come up with in the discussion, we have always been aware of and actually sort of encouraged different approaches.
Interesting. And so, David, you represent it's in the name, the Association of Digital Verification Professionals. You are well aware that we live in a world where digital identity and digital verification is fast becoming a normalized, a reality for many. And the question is how to do it. So can you tell us, please, a bit about where your organization currently sits in the debate? I know we've covered quite a bit of your activity, but where are you right now on the legislative and policy side in terms of advocating for your position?
Yeah, hi, Joel. So just quickly introducing the ADVP for listeners who may not know who we are. So we're the industry body representing the majority of digital verification service providers in the UK. We do, between us and members, 5 million right-to-work checks a year. We're doing roughly around about 2 billion age checks globally, so that's a major British export. We're employing around about 11,000 people in the UK, and we've brought in about £500,000 worth of investment over the last couple of years. So that's just introducing where we are. I think when we last had a podcast, Joel, we had Tony Blair Institute on that. And I think one of the things that's come out since then, where they've modified their position slightly, is they're looking for a very British solution, whatever that might mean. We don't know what that means, by the way, but a very British solution to the way that we handle identity. And I think one of the things that we're trying to do from our organisation is trying to get that alignment of views as part of the discussion that's taking place around consultation on digital ID. I went to, when Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, announced the National ID programme back in September, I went to a meeting organised by Big Brother Watch at the Conservative Party conference in Manchester, which is just down the road from our offices. And I have to say, I was very nervous going into that meeting, hat of my head, just trying to be a member of the general public, and sat in a row. Actually, I didn't realise I was sitting about 2 or 3 seats away from Phil. I hadn't met Phil before. And there was a presentation there by Big Brother Watch, David Davis, who's quite a renowned MP in the UK, which were all very adamant against the national ID scheme as it was being brought in. So I was feeling very sheepish and thinking, how on earth could I talk about the Digital Attributes and Trust Framework, or the DVS Trust Framework as it's known now, in that group. But the first person to speak was Phil. And Phil gave an argument in favour of the DVS Trust Framework, which made me just think, I wish I could do that. Because it was so articulate. And I'm going to embarrass Phil now, because the reason for the DVS sector existing and the reason why this whole industry has come about is because of Phil and the campaign that he did back in underneath the Tony Blair government, as you mentioned earlier on. And I think it's worthwhile exploring those issues and the problems that exist with national IDs, because those problems exist with all national IDs, wherever they are. And I'm not sure that's given enough attention, really. So I've just passed you the baton, Bill.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. That's very complimentary. I was just one voice amongst many. But I think the key sort of inflection point last time was a thing called the Crosby Report. This is when, if you remember, Gordon Brown took over as Prime Minister from Tony Blair, and from the Treasury commissioned Sir James Crosby to look at this digital identity scheme that was being built under the Home Office. And we were just saying this is just crazy. We opposed it in principle, and it was also very bad. But even back then, we were saying, look, this is about people being able to prove certain things about themselves. You don't need to slap a single unique identifier on every person and put them in a register and line them up and fingerprint them and all these other things. There are technologies that allow you to use numbers to allow people to give a pretty good level of assurance that they are who they claim to be, or they have the characteristic which they claim to have, and that should be sufficient for most situations and most risk assessments. Human beings do trust very differently than systems. It's a very human trait, trust. What systems do, because they are algorithmic or ultimately binary or what have you, that they must make risk assessments. And so you can design, architect systems to be able to deal with the sorts of risk assessments that have to be made within legal or other rules. Where NO2ID comes from, where civil society and where I think many people come from, is that it's not just about numbers and systems and legal rules. It's also about values and rights and principles. And things as fundamental, foundational as ID have major impacts in people's lives, or can do. And oftentimes it is those people who have more different lives, more marginalised, more vulnerable, they have characteristics which make them stand out and be discriminated against, that are worst affected by these systems. And they are tending to be built for, if you like, the normal case, the good little citizen. Yeah? Civil society, my organisation, many other colleagues. I mean, David's mentioned Big Brother Watch, but there are dozens and dozens of such organisations in this country and hundreds, if not thousands, around the world, are all basically advocating for fundamental human rights and for data rights and civil rights. If those are not properly attended to, if you like, if those are not used as the boundary conditions within which an architecture is designed, then you start to get things which will trample all over people's rights. They will have all sorts of impacts in their lives, which we see in some of the systems that are out there.
David, I want to ask you to bounce off that idea. You mentioned that the Tony Blair Institute has sort of reversed their position, and they're tweaked it, so they're now looking for a very British solution. But to speak to Phil's point, I've heard you talk before about the sort of notion that centralized mandatory digital ID is in itself an un-British, if you will, sort of idea. Can you expound on that a bit?
And I'm sort of reluctant to say Britishness, because it's not really Britishness. It's actually the debate, and it's a really good debate that's happening in the UK around the consultation, is about what type of society do we want, and what does it actually mean to transform public service delivery. Because in the consultation that's taken place, it talks about national ID, and then it talks about transformation of public services. But there's a massive gap as how do you get from one to another, right? We're trying to solve cultural issues with a technical solution. So just because you've got a hammer, not everything is a nail, right? So we need to sort of reframe the debate. Now, just picking up on Phil's point and talking to your question directly, Joel, is there's a difference between participation in society and eligibility, right? So when Phil is talking about digital ID, and what we try to talk about in the DVS sector is about participation in society, and that is just like an inalienable right. You have a right to be able to participate in society, in a free society. Now, you're going to have different eligibility criteria to be able to access whatever service. And I guess the ultimate one in this context is right to work. So it's legitimate to say that you could have a digital identity for right to work, but that's not going to prevent you participating, or it shouldn't prevent you from participating in the rest of society. And what makes that possible is the concept of choice. So I should be able to choose what identity I have. So I only need to use my right to work identity if I need to prove my right to work. If I'm going to go shopping or do whatever else I might want to do, I will want to use different identities. So it's actually quite a simple thing, isn't it? Because the person we are now is not the people we were 10 years ago or 20 years ago, right? We change, we have different characteristics, different roles we play in the social groups that we mix with every day, right? People have nom de plumes and things like that. So it's legitimate that you can have more than one identity underpinned by your legal identity, but you don't need to be having one single ID to be able to participate. You can have multiple IDs. And I think that's really where we're going. It's about the principle of choice. Human beings all love wearing a badge. And, if it's a badge that says something that we're proud of or something that we want to be associated with, you're not going to be able to stop people wearing that badge, right? But if it's a badge that's being enforced to show compliance, then you're going to get resistance to that. And the digital exclusion issue comes up because this is about compliance and it's not about who we are. So there's a difference between participation and eligibility.
Yeah, it's a really elegant way of saying it, because the images that come into my mind will come to others, and I'm sorry, I will put it in these extreme terms. Last time, David Blunkett said, no one has anything to fear from being correctly identified. And we simply answered that with a series of symbols. Stars, pink triangles. Yeah, David's point about badges is, if you choose a badge and you're happy to stand by it, that is one thing. If someone pins a badge to you, makes you a target, uses it to direct you down a different route than everyone else, that is what I mean by the bad side of centralised mandatory ID, which admittedly they're sort of fudging a little bit now. I mean, we've talked about the way in which the government's position has been changed. They are talking about the digital ID, but they're talking about it in isolation from the architecture that they've already created and that they're already forcing people to use. So while they say, oh, well, the digital ID won't be compulsory, it is already compulsory for company directors to have something called a verified one login, where you're biometrically verified to actually be able to submit your legally required filings for a company that you run, or you're a director of, or you're a person of significant control of. Yeah, that, if you like, is the mouth of a funnel trap that narrows down over time, to, oh, well, in order to use this digital ID, you're basically going to have the GovUK, the government app, on your phone, and in that app will be a wallet, and that wallet won't actually be like the other wallets that you might be used to, because this one is the one that the government credentials will work in, but they may not work elsewhere, precisely because, in terms of the standard, because this wallet, in order to determine whether the credential that you're showing is valid, will dial home and check that, and then thereby creating an audit trail, which may or may not be in a centralised national digital identity register. And there we are, we're back to the races. It's a phone this time, and an app and a wallet, not a card with an RFID chip in it and a giant database at Home Office, but the architecture that has already been built and is already being imposed by some of the very government departments that are pushing aspects of this scheme, are why we actually have to stop it. Yeah, there are sensible ways forward here. There are components in play, which, as David has said, I and others have advocated for, though we oppose particular ID schemes, we advocated for an approach, a trustworthy approach to things, a rights-respecting approach to things, and that's what we've got to, get focused on. But while the government just keeps on relentlessly saying, oh, well, give us our digital ID and we'll fix all the public services, I mean, this is just nonsense. We talk about ID, but we are talking about something that is inside a already highly complex system of government departments that don't even actually trust each other's databases, and frankly, some of them shouldn't. And, they're just painting this sort of magical picture as if digital ID is some sort of panacea.
Can I ask, David, these are all very kind of high-level issues that go to the heart of human rights and whatnot, but to speak to, things the government has already created, or helped create outside of itself, maybe you can talk a bit about the sort of like economic argument for the DVS trust framework and the providers there. Like, this is something that has had a fair bit of investment and time put into it. And there does seem to be this ongoing worry that having built this up, the government now just will sort of, tip it over.
So I think the important thing of hearing voices in the way that Phil articulated it and the industry articulated it is the risk of unintended consequences. Right? So I genuinely believe that there is no one in government or advising government who wants to be creating the type of dystopia scenarios that Phil is talking about. But it's the unintended consequences of this. So, Churchill had a phrase that I can paraphrase here is that, we shape our buildings and then our buildings shape us, right? And it's the same with the technology here. So it's whatever we're building, whatever we're constructing is going to be new for us, it's going to be changing things, but for the generations that follow us, this is going to be that normal. So that's why this debate's quite important. But to your point, there is a concern that in what the government's going to do is actually going to undermine the DVS industry. And it has two ways of doing that. Firstly, just the continued uncertainty and discussion about this causes decisions to be delayed. So I know, for example, in the stuff that we're working on in local government, decisions are delayed because everybody's waiting to see what happens. So it just makes things go slower, and that undermines business cases of return on investment and things like that. So that's one thing. The second thing is that there's part of the consultation which talks about use case scenarios that move into what are classically seen as private sector use cases, and that could be either opening a bank account or the local charity scanning someone's ID and things like that. And they're concerned there that eats in or undermines solutions that's coming out from the DVS sector, because effectively that's creating a two-tier system. All digital IDs are equal, but some digital IDs are going to be more equal than others, is the concern that goes with that. So that's what's coming across as the nervousness from the DVS sector. But I have a slightly different view of that, in the sense that I don't think there's a land grab. There's a risk of a land grab, definitely, but I don't think there's a conscious land grab like that. But I do think there's people who don't have the sort of background that Phil's got, or some of the DVS providers have got, who really understand this stuff. So I've got an expression that identity is like time. We think we know what it is until we discover it's all relative, right? And this is the learning curve for someone who's coming into this space, and central government teams are in this space as well. They're thinking, okay, well, just by creating this national ID, we can actually then join up X, Y, and Z, right? It takes a while to get your head around all the different perspectives that are related to that. So the risk is not the conspiratorial side of this, it's the cock-up theory of this, which is equally as risky, right? But, one of the principles I think we should be borrowing from the humanitarian area in the policy making in this space is the principle of do no harm, right? So can we introduce legislation and regulation that isn't going to necessarily undermine the advances and the significant advances that this government has already delivered with the Data Use and Access Act, that it probably doesn't actually realise what it's done or how significant the revolution it is that it's introduced.
So if I'm hearing you, David, and I want to go back to you, Phil, with this, it's sort of, this notion, people are afraid, I think, of digital ID, and rightly so in certain respects. But in others, you're saying it's not that there's necessarily evil intention powering this. It's that it's more of a bumbling in the dark, and you're going to end up with people, knocking things over, so more of a danger of a big unintended accident than anybody trying to sort of impose rigid control.
I think I'd push back pretty hard on that, actually.
Would you feel? Okay.
Well, it's not a conspiracy. I'm talking about people who have actually been doing this same thing for nearly quarter of a century.
Yeah.
And if you look back in history and in British, we're talking about a British solution, ID cards have been were imposed in World War I, in World War II, and, Tony Blair had a go in the early 2000s, and the Tony Blair Institute, pushing Starmer around or whatever, got this thing announced. And it's the same players. Home Office with its agendas and everything else. So, yes, okay, I'm not saying there's a giant conspiracy. There's no 12-foot lizards pulling strings here. But these are long-held agendas by powerful entities who ignore a whole bunch of things that they have been told time and time again. The way they use language, for example. We mentioned trust, a trust framework. Now, the government is saying, well, we want this digital ID to be, I think they say inclusive, trusted, and useful, I think, are the three words that they use. Trusted. Well, if you grab onto something that's called a trust framework and it is doing something that can be trusted, maybe that is convenient. But I've already said to ministers to their face that you can't just say trust us. Trust is a choice that people make, and it's based on, and Damon O'Neill was the philosopher, stated this really, really succinctly, really beautifully. It's not about trust, it's about whether someone is trustworthy. Do they demonstrate that they are competent, that they are honest, transparent, and that they are reliable? And if a system, if a person, if an organisation, an institution can demonstrate that over time, then yes, they may get trust because they are trustworthy. But simply to claim it or mandate it by passing a law saying you must use this trusted solution, this is not trust.
David, just to speak to this sort of need for these things, I know you had mentioned the possibility or the need for establishing a sort of industry-led ethics committee. And especially now with agentic AI emerging as a new thing. Can you speak a bit to that and about, just the notion of a trust framework that does exist and, how that indicates to people that they should trust you and can?
Yeah, I think it's important that in this debate and whatever comes out of the consultation, that we have a forum somewhere where these issues can be discussed, because it's important that the voices, civil society groups, is heard for the checks and balances. And Phil has experience of that actually previously, so he's probably better answering your question, to be honest with you, Joel. We've looked at it from an ADVP point of view, and ahead of the government doing anything in this space, we want to set up some kind of industry-led ethics committee to work with the civil society groups to help shape this conversation. So as ADVP, we've already met up with the executive with these groups, and we've got a members meeting coming up in a couple of weeks' time where we're going to advance this conversation, because I think it's important that we understand each other before we decide we disagree with each other. And I think one of the things I've observed in this debate is, and it doesn't matter if it's the Tony Blair Institute or it's the civil servants or it's the ministers or the civil rights group or even amongst ADVP members themselves, is that we're using the same words to describe different things and different words to describe the same things. And so we rush to judgment on that without really understanding what's taking place. And of course, one of the things that we know from, is a phrase that Peter Ustinov used to say, which I love, is certainty divides us, right? And doubts unite us. So we need to concentrate on our doubts more in this conversation, rather than the certainties or the motivations we perceive that other people have, because we may be misunderstanding. Now, I just want to go back to this point about the green-eyed monsters or whatever they might be, because actually there is a really substantial, serious point here that we've got to unearth in this conversation. One of the most reliable systems in any organisation is payroll. And the reason why is because everybody checks their payslip, right? And if the payslip is not right, you go and challenge, right? So payroll systems tend to be the most reliable because it's dealing with your money, something that you control, right? So I think when we're talking about the future, we're actually talking about something that's a bit like the financial system, but it's instead of being money, it's your data. And instead of having banks, you have holder service providers or wallet providers, whatever your name of choice is, and then you have control over that. And we don't have that at the moment. Everything's organised around organisations. It is ingrained in everybody's perception of normal that organisations have your data, right? GDPR is developed to protect organisations from things going wrong with data. It doesn't actually work for the individual, as you can see from those reams and reams of terms and conditions that you have to sign up to that no one can ever read. So it protects organisations, and it protects that organisational-centric view of the world. And what we're trying to create here is a world where people own their own data, not organisations, and that is quite an advanced conversation. And we can talk about that, and we can intellectualize about that, and it's quite simple, isn't it? It's just say, well, yeah, it's my data, it's my decision, I should be able to own it. It's quite a simple thing to say. But it's a bit like any belief system. It's a bit like religion. You can intellectualize it, but it's only once you become a believer do you see the world differently.
Okay, I want to offer another analogy. I don't disagree with the banking payroll example, but we actually have an ID system in the UK that is based on the World War II ID card numbers originally. It's our National Health Service. After the Second World War, and when ID cards had been abolished, they were all collected up. We then decided we were going to do an NHS. They got the cards out again and added a number. 1 for dad, 2 for mum, 3, 4, 5 for the kids. That was the original NHS number when the NHS was run on pieces of paper. And your medical records was in a thing called the Lloyd George envelope, which was a very specific arrangement where the GP owned or held the paper, the cards that went into the envelope, but someone else paid for the ink so that when the patient died, the owner of the ink got what was written on the cards. That translated from the 90s onwards into, obviously, digital systems. Yeah. But what we have as an arrangement there is something close, I think, to what people do understand, that they want to be able to see what is in their medical records. They want to be able to make choices about who can see that, who can use that. Some people, lots of people, need help in interpreting what is in their medical record. It's complicated. So you have a confidential relationship at the heart of the system between you and your doctor, you and your medical team. Now, increasingly, government's trying to grab this. They're even trying to grab the NHS number for use beyond the NHS now. And if they can't get their digital ID number, certain departments want to use it outside of the healthcare system. And again, this is the playing out of an identity system. Every information system at scale dealing with human beings is going to need some sort of identity architecture at its heart. And people, I think, do understand things about their medical records in a way that they don't necessarily, especially because it's so normalised these days, think about just personal data or all that stuff I do on my phone. Yeah. So, in a way, also, the government's current architecture, the GovUK app, if you like, is quite explicitly modelled on the NHS app. Yeah. So we're seeing parallel, very similar architectures. So I should say I don't just coordinate NO2ID. I also have been coordinating an organisation called Med Confidential for well over a decade now. And that's seeking to ensure that every use of patients' data in and around the NHS is consensual, safe, and transparent. So I've got a long history of building very large systems, systems that do genuinely provide life-supporting services to 70 million people now, and has done so for several generations. Yeah, creating, by the way, a data set that's possibly one of the most valuable data sets on the planet, which is why everyone's trying to grab it. But there are lessons that we can learn from these analogies. Yes, let's look at things like payroll and why that is often a system that works. Let's think about, even supermarkets. Where in the government consultation is my receipt? When do I get the receipt? They get their audit trail. When do I get my receipt for having been checked? That I can carry around and know that, yes, I can prove I have been checked, so you don't have to check me again, maybe. Or if there's a problem, I've got my receipt. I don't just have to sort of say, help, help, help. I can say, this went wrong. Fix it. They say they want to do that. Well, where's the mechanism to help them do it? And I think, again, I know it's quite complicated to hold large systems in your mind, but if people think about the way in which they relate to a lifelong system embedded inside an institution that is entirely dedicated to keeping people healthy and alive, that is the sort of thing that we need to engineer here.
Well, so David, we're almost at a time here, but to that end, what does good digital ID look like from your perspective? Because the message here is, and I think it's interesting. It's not necessarily no to ID. It's no to centralized government ID. That relies on systems based in notions of surveillance and control. So that's not what the ADVP members do. David, what does a good digital ID look like?
Well, I'm really glad you asked that question, Joel, right at the end. That's perfect. Because, and this goes back to the need for education, the need to explain, right? This administration has delivered in the Data Use and Access Act a fundamental change in the way that data is managed in the UK economy, and enables that transfer of power from organisations to individuals in exactly the way that Phil's talking about. So the DVS Trust Framework, delivered by this government, started back in 2008 by the Crosby Report. It's taken a long time to work out, is what good looks like, right? It's done, it's delivered, it's working. DVS providers are doing it. And then when you look at the use cases that they're talking about, we can deliver those use cases. We can deliver those quicker in time for the next election without legislative changes. So Phil talks about receipts. When someone goes to a right-to-work check, we can create for them a reusable identity for right-to-work. We can deliver that within 12 months. It's, there's suppliers already doing that stuff. So we've got the trust framework. Within that trust framework is the information gateway. So the government's going to be putting its code of practice for the information gateway. That will be going through Parliament once the election's all over, because the regional authorities are going to sign us all off, right? And so that looks like that will hit the books somewhere, towards the end of the year. And the information gateway gives DVS providers and individuals the right to have public information, and actually also through GDPR information from private companies, transferred into their personal wallets. So we have the mechanisms in legislation now delivered by this administration. The politicians generally, society generally, doesn't understand the power that's delivered, right? And that's our mission here now, is how do we do that education, and how do we make that legislation begin to work and deliver that TBI British vision that gives people generally control over their data, how do we begin to do that education piece to make it actually happen?
Thanks again to David Crack of the ADVP and Phil Booth of the NO2ID campaign for sharing their thoughts today. And thanks to you for listening. For all the latest news on biometrics and digital identity in the UK and elsewhere, be sure to visit www.biometricupdate.com.